Welcome to the 34th reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. Summer holidays tension. Dad never took holidays, so our summer treat was a day trip via train to Walton-on-the-Naze, where Mum's Aunt Blanche, the aunt who'd looked after us when Mum was sick at the farm, ran a summer boarding house on Eagle Avenue with her husband, Fred. I loved the train ride more than the seaside itself, especially as Mum always packed lots of cheese sandwiches for the journey. As soon as we left the train, she'd announce, "We can't go to the beach until we've been to see Aunt Blanche. She'll never forgive me if I don't see her." Despite a few of these visits, I never thought we meant anything to her. Her coldness towards me at the farm had made me a little afraid of her. We entered the sitting room, crowded with couches and easy chairs, to wait for her to be freed from her duties with her paying guests. Instructed by Mum to sit very still on one of the couches, we waited forever until she appeared. You'd have thought the Queen herself was set to make us a visit. Din took it all in his stride. Dad sat as stiff as one of the scarecrows the Colonel placed in his fields at Park Farm. They never fooled the birds, and Aunt Blanche wasn't fooled either. She knew we'd only come to show our faces. Mum seemed nervous, only speaking when spoken to. Her aunt always said she couldn't spend much time with us, as it was her busy season. She didn't want us there, and I wondered why my mother bothered. It shortened our precious beach time. Uncle Fred never showed his face. After all the preliminary fuss, we stayed long enough to hear how much David and I had grown, and then we took off to find a spot on the beach. The sandy beach was always crowded with families, and the secret to a successful day was to grab a few feet of sand and jealously guard it, otherwise it would be snatched from you, even with your blanket laid down to claim it. Each of us took turns sitting on it throughout the day. My dad and Din couldn't swim, and Mum refused to because of a near-drowning accident when young. David and I couldn't swim either, so we mostly made sandcastles, dug channels down to the sea, and paddled at its edge, gentle tidal waves dribbling back and forth over our feet. David wore short trousers, but I was forced to tuck my dress into my knickers in order not to get it wet. Most of the older men didn't don bathing costumes, but rolled up their long trousers and shirt sleeves, and sometimes wore a handkerchief knotted on four corners to shade their heads from the sun. So comical. Some families rented canvas deck chairs, but Mum said we didn't have money for those. Din usually bought David and me an ice cream during the afternoon, and later on we were allowed to wander down the beach in search of a Punch and Judy puppet show. A rather violent performance, with Punch seeing fit to repeatedly hit his wife, Judy, and beat his dog with a stick. A seaside tradition mimicking many a domestic scene of the time. Before we left the beach, we searched for a piece of seaweed to take home. By nailing it to our back door, Mum said we could tell if it would rain or not by how moist it became. Another way she comically did her weather forecasting was to send us out into the garden and tell us to look up at the sky. If we could find enough blue sky to make a Dutchman a pair of trousers, the day would probably turn out fair. Sand between our toes and pleasant memories of the day in our minds all too soon, we had to leave, gathering our collection of shells and the seaweed weather forecaster. If Dad was in a good mood, we went into a fish and chip cafe before catching the train home. As much as I wanted to eat, I dreaded the thought of going inside. The freedom of the open beach over, Tenseness and claustrophobia assailed me as soon as we walked in the door and sat at a table. Sick to my stomach with the dreaded anticipation of my father's anger. "Can't we buy the chips and eat them on the train?" I'd beg Mum, but everybody but me voted to stay. With my father, everything always had to be perfect. His eyes glared at David and me, silently warning us to behave properly as people were watching. The whole world watched, waiting to catch us doing something bad. Mum tensed up too, as she knew full well how our outings often ended in explosions from Dad. During one of these visits to the cafe, I vomited up my fish and chips. My father stormed out in obvious embarrassment, claiming I had ruined the chance of us ever eating in there again. "We'll never be able to hold our heads up now," he said, causing me to believe I'd brought the whole family down from whatever lofty position we held. Bad enough that we were only day trippers, not as important as the seasonal folks who paid to stay at Aunt Blanche's posh boarding house, let alone show ourselves up like that, was his refrain. The rhythm of the train's wheels on the tracks drummed the message into my head all the way home. If we went to visit one of his friends at their house, he issued the same warning as we made our way along the street. "The neighbours will all be looking out their windows at us, so walk tall, don't slouch, and make sure you don't show us up when we get there," he'd say. By the time we reached our destination, I was so jittery I couldn't enjoy anything, no matter how warm the reception. As time went by, he came out with us as a family, less and less. This became a blessing to me, although in one way it kept what went on behind closed doors less likely to be believed by anybody who thought they knew him. Dad and I took to verbal sparring matches. Although I gave as good as he gave, they always turned physical when he lost his temper. His habit of swearing at me, only mild swear words such as bloody and sod, abhorred me. Rudely and stupidly, I called him a walking dictionary. It became my nickname for him, and he couldn't stand it. Quite rightly so. I knew how to push his buttons, and it never took long for him to come for me, face bright red, eyes bulging, veins standing out on his forehead. Down rained the blows on my head, my shoulders, any part of me he could reach. I tried to protect myself, but would be down on the floor screaming for mercy in no time while he threatened to kill me. "I hate you, I hate you. One of these days I'll swing for you," he shouted. Hanging was still the ultimate capital punishment in Britain. It wouldn't be abolished until 1965, and my dad, in his moments of rage, claimed he would gladly pay that price if he could get rid of me. In July of 1955, a woman named Ruth Ellis had been hanged at Holloway Prison. Only 12 years old at the time, I remembered it being in all the papers. I remembered my parents discussing it. She had shot her lover, and the jury took only 14 minutes to find her guilty. She didn't appeal the conviction. Thousands of people signed petitions asking for the death penalty to be lifted, to no avail. Many suggested she was a battered woman, driven by desperation to commit the act. No mercy for her on that score. Driven or not, a rope was placed around her neck. The trap door beneath her opened, and down she went. End of her. It terrified me to imagine my father being willing to suffer the same fate over me. I had nightmares of him choking me and would wake up with a physical tightness around my throat, as if he'd been in the room attempting to strangle me. I suffered a certain guilt that I had the power to bring forth his death, although it would also include mine if he acted on his threat. One day he went after me so violently I threatened to report him to the police. He laughed in my face and said if I did that, I'd get taken away and put into a children's home. I'd never get to see any of my family again. Anyway, he said, he had friends in the police force, a lie, and he'd tell them the real truth. They'd never believe me. I knew I wouldn't survive being taken away from Mum, Dindin, and David, the only family I had in the entire world. I didn't know who I could possibly share my troubles with. I certainly didn't say anything to Mum, because she couldn't protect me. She faded into the background whenever trouble broke out. Some nights I sat at the top of the stairs and listened to Mum and Dad discussing me, the what's wrong with her and what are we going to do with her ongoing dilemma. My mother was marooned in the middle of the problem of me. She knew about my school difficulties and that I didn't make friends easily, but she didn't know how to help me. Nobody did. If only my dad could have said to me, "I love you," even once. Every time he shouted the words, "I hate you," and I shouted them back, the chasm between us grew deeper and wider. Inside, I cried out, "But I'm your little girl. Don't you love me?" I would have given anything for him to stop and say, "What am I doing? What are we doing to each other? Let's stop this." We were both at fault, both stubborn. Deep in my heart, I wanted to love him. Deep in his heart, I believe he wanted to love me, but neither of us could make the first move towards reconciliation. So many times I left the house in despair and walked to St. Peter's Church on North Hill, answering the call of the bell which periodically rang out. If I went inside, the doors always open, maybe somebody would help me sort out the mess of my life. I didn't get any further than to stand on the opposite side of the street, staring at the impressive stone Norman building, willing some special person to come out and talk to me. Then I thought of hopping onto my bike and pedaling madly along any old road until I ended up exhausted somewhere miles and miles from Colchester, hopefully rescued by a caring person. But that didn't seem such a sensible thing to do. Those things only happened in books or films, when some gallant person would rescue a troubled child stuck out in the middle of nowhere. I'd probably end up dying of exposure before anyone found me. At those times, I wished I had an uncle or auntie who would take me in until I sorted myself out. Escaping my miserable life entertained my thoughts frequently, but what prevented me from running away was the horrible thought of abandoning my mother, despite our lack of closeness. I caused her pain by staying, but if I left, I knew she would have more pain. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.